Marcus Ellison was 39 years old the morning his wife told him, with the flat calm of someone closing a browser tab, that he would die alone and broke. He was standing in the kitchen he had renovated himself. Every tile laid by his own hands, every cabinet hung level with a spirit level he had inherited from his grandfather, and she was dressed for a dinner he hadn't been invited to. Her perfume expensive, and her expression composed in a way that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with calculation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply told him the truth as she understood it, set her keys on the granite countertop he had installed on a July weekend 4 years prior, and walked out. He stood there for a long moment, holding a coffee mug she had given him as a joke gift 3 Christmases back. It said, "World's okayest husband." He put it down carefully. What Nicole Ellison had no idea about, what she had never thought to ask in nearly 7 years of marriage, was that the joint checking account she had drained of $127,000 in incremental, careful transfers over 11 months was not the account that mattered. Not by a considerable distance. What none of them knew was what Marcus had been doing with his Saturdays for the past 9 years before he ever came home to Nashville, before he ever met her in that hotel bar near the convention center, before he ever decided that being quiet about what he had built was the same as being nothing at all. What happened next would cost Nicole everything she had believed was already hers. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in through the kitchen windows at an angle that Marcus had calculated when he chose the eastern exposure during the renovation. He had not told Nicole why he specified that orientation in the plans. She hadn't asked. She had approved the contractor quote and gone back to her phone, and Marcus had nodded and made a note and continued doing what he had always done, which was to think 3 moves ahead and say very little about it. He sat with his coffee cradled in both hands and looked at the tile work along the backsplash. Portuguese limestone, hand-cut, fitted to within a 1/16 of an inch. His grandfather, Curtis Ellison, had been a finish carpenter in Raleigh for 40 years, and the man had told him once, with the kind of certainty that only came from 4 decades of watching other people's mistakes, "Son, sloppy work is just deferred reckoning. It'll catch up to you. It always does." Marcus had applied that philosophy to everything he touched: his tile work, his ledgers, his patience. He had grown up in a modest house in Charlotte, the youngest of 3, raised mostly by his grandmother Eloise after his mother went back to work full-time following his father's accident. Eloise was a compact woman with an opinion about everything and silence about nothing that mattered, and she had spotted his aptitude early. She had pushed him toward engineering with a single argument: "You already see how things fit together, baby. Now get someone to pay you for it." He did. He graduated from NC State with a degree in civil engineering, took a job with a mid-size infrastructure firm in Nashville, spent 6 years doing exactly what they hired him to do, and spent the other hours doing something they had no visibility into at all. His direct supervisor at the firm believed Marcus drove a used Camry because he was frugal. His colleagues believed he stayed late because he was ambitious. None of them asked the right questions, and he had never volunteered the answers. That was not arrogance. That was simply the lesson his grandfather had passed down alongside the spirit level and the hand plane. You don't talk about what you're building while you're still building it. He had met Nicole at a Marriott bar near the convention center on a Thursday night in March 8 years ago. She was there with colleagues from the marketing agency where she had just been promoted to senior account manager. She was wearing a red dress and laughing at something her colleague had said, and when she turned and looked at him, it was with a kind of frank appraisal that he had found refreshing. She was direct. She was smart. She asked him what he did, and actually listened to the answer, and then asked a follow-up question that showed she had heard the first one. He had proposed 18 months later, in this same kitchen, before the renovation, when the countertops were laminate and the backsplash was the original ceramic from 1987 that he had promised himself he would replace. He had found that version of her admirable for a long time. The change had not been sudden. It was the kind of thing you noticed later, retroactively, when you laid the years end to end and saw the pattern the individual moments had concealed. A comment about his truck. Not unkind, just comparative. Just the naming of what other husbands drove. A joke at dinner about his salary, delivered with that particular smile that made it technically a compliment. The way she had started answering for him at parties, filling in his silences with a version of him she found more presentable. The way she had begun, in the last 18 months, to speak about the house as though she had built it. His kitchen tiles, his deck boards, his oak tree in the backyard, all of it slowly becoming hers in the language she used, as if language were a deed of transfer. He had noted all of it. He had said none of it. He was sitting with his second cup and the morning's quiet when his phone buzzed on the counter with a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words. Check your mailbox. He set down the mug. He went to the front door. What was in the mailbox was a single folded sheet of paper. No envelope. No stamp. Just paper, folded twice, with his name written on the outside in handwriting he did not recognize. Inside was a date, a time, and an address, a coffee shop on Gallatin Avenue, 7 blocks from the house. And one sentence below that, you don't know the whole picture yet. He read it twice, folded it, and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt. He went back inside. He finished his coffee. He thought about sloppy work and deferred reckonings. He already had some suspicions. He had been accumulating them the way a structural engineer accumulates load data, quietly, without announcement, because the math was not yet complete. Nicole had begun keeping her phone face down in the evenings, which was new. She had begun having phone calls in the car that ended before she came through the door, which was new. 3 weeks ago, he had noticed a charge on the joint account for a florist he did not recognize, for an amount that suggested a significant arrangement on a day that was no anniversary he could account for. He had said nothing. He had written it down. That evening, while Nicole was at what she had described as a client dinner, Marcus sat at his desk in the small room she called his study, and he called his office and opened his laptop. He went into the joint account portal. He had been monitoring it for 42 days. Beginning the morning he noticed the 3rd unexplained charge in a single week. What he found, laid out across those 42 days, and then going back 11 months further once he requested the full statement history, was meticulous. It was patient. It was the financial equivalent of someone who had done this before, or had at minimum thought about doing it for a very long time. 43 transfers. Always under $3,000. Always on days he was confirmed to be out of town on site visits. Always to an account he could not immediately identify but whose routing number, after 20 minutes of research, traced to a private savings account at a credit union in Brentwood. $127,000. His hands didn't shake. He opened a new spreadsheet. He documented every transfer, date, amount, destination routing number. He screenshotted each transaction. He forwarded the account statements to his personal email address, then to a secondary email address Nicole had no knowledge of. He worked without rushing, without the tight chest and elevated pulse that he imagined most people brought to this kind of discovery. He was a structural engineer. He read stress data for a living. He understood that the numbers did not become more or less true depending on how you felt about them. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined everything he did when the stakes were real. He went back further. He looked at the household spending pattern over the prior 2 years. He found a credit card in her name alone, not their joint card, that he had not known existed, with statements going back 19 months, being paid from the joint account in amounts small enough to not trigger his attention until now. The balance on that card, currently, was $0. She was paying it down. With his money, the card had been used at restaurants Marcus had never visited. At a hotel in downtown Nashville on a Tuesday evening, Marcus now remembered clearly. He had been on a site visit in Clarksville that day and had texted her goodnight at 9:47 p.m., and she had responded with a heart emoji and a sleeping face, and at a boutique men's clothing store on 2nd Avenue that Marcus had never entered. He sat with that for a long moment. 19 months of calculated concealment. 19 months of hotel rooms and florists and men's clothing, charged to a card paid with money she had redirected from the account they shared. The architecture of it was almost impressive. You didn't need to be a structural engineer to recognize when someone had been building a load-bearing wall in a room they weren't supposed to be in. The question was only what you did once you saw the blueprints. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Then he looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard, visible even in the low evening light, its shape familiar and solid and unchanged. His grandmother's voice came to him, clear and unhurried. "Baby, you always knew who you were. Don't let anyone make you forget." He picked up his phone and called the one person he knew would understand exactly what he needed. He met with Patricia Wynn on a Tuesday morning in her office on Church Street, downtown Nashville. Patricia was 61 years old, a family law attorney with 32 years of practice, and she had the kind of stillness that came from having seen every variation of human cruelty that money and intimacy could produce. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she did not smile when she greeted him. She shook his hand, gestured to the chair, and said, "Tell me what you have." He told her. He laid out the printed spreadsheet, the transaction screenshots, the credit card statements, the documentation he had assembled over 6 weeks of careful observation. He spoke in the same register he used when presenting load analysis to city engineers: facts, sequence, quantities, implications. Patricia did not flinch. She reviewed each page with her reading glasses on and her expression unchanged. When he finished, she set the last page down and looked at him over her glasses. "You documented all of this before confronting her." "Yes, good. Most people confront first and document second, which is the wrong order." She tapped the stack of papers. "This is the right order. Tell me about the other account, the one that isn't joint." He told her about that too. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She has no idea what she stepped into." He nodded. She told him what came next. He listened to every word. Preparation was the work. 2 days after his meeting with Patricia, Marcus drove to Charlotte on a Saturday morning. He told Nicole he had a site visit. She did not ask where. His uncle Gerald lived in the same house in the Greer Heights neighborhood, where Marcus had grown up visiting on Sundays. Gerald was 68, semi-retired, had spent 30 years as a machinist and 15 before that in the Army, and he had the long memory of a man who had watched the world carefully and formed opinions he did not share lightly. Marcus sat at Gerald's kitchen table with coffee he had not been asked whether he wanted. It simply appeared, and told his uncle what he knew. Gerald listened with his hands folded on the table. He did not interrupt. When Marcus finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "You know who that Brentwood account belongs to." It was not a question. "I have a name," Marcus said. "Drew Whitfield. I know he's in commercial real estate. I know he and Nicole have had at least 11 lunches I can document." Gerald nodded slowly. "And you know what else?" Marcus waited. That man had a lawsuit filed against him 2 years ago. Fraud, investment scheme. It was settled out of court, quietly, but your attorney will find it if she looks. He unfolded his hands and picked up his coffee. "Your grandmother told me about Nicole, back when you first brought her around. Said she smiled with her mouth only." Marcus looked at his hands. "What would she say right now?" he asked. Gerald smiled for the first time. "She'd say, 'You already know what to do. Stop asking permission to do it.'" Marcus drove back to Nashville on Sunday morning. He arrived home before Nicole returned from wherever she had spent the night. He made eggs. He set 2 plates. When she walked through the door at 10:30 with a story about a girlfriend's guest room and a smile calibrated for reassurance, he kissed her cheek and told her the eggs were still warm. She sat down and ate across from him and talked about her week, and he answered in the right places and asked questions that kept her comfortable, and she had no idea. Not a single idea, that every word she said was landing in a man who had already seen the full shape of what she had built and had been quietly, methodically, dismantling it for 6 weeks. Real power operated in quiet rooms. By Thursday morning, Patricia's investigative accountant had confirmed the Brentwood account. It belonged, jointly, to Drew Whitfield and a subsidiary LLC he controlled. The same LLC had received $127,000 across 11 months. The same LLC had a prior fraud complaint filed in Davidson County that had been resolved through a non-disclosure agreement. The same LLC had a pattern, the accountant determined, of receiving transferred funds from at least 2 prior sources that bore the structural hallmarks of marital asset drainage. Drew Whitfield was not a successful man with a sideline in infidelity. He was a moderately successful man with a long history of finding women who had access to marital assets and helping them quietly drain those assets, typically in exchange for a share of the proceeds and the promise of a future together that never fully materialized. Patricia shared this with Marcus over the phone on Thursday afternoon in the methodical tone she used when evidence had exceeded what the opposing party could explain away. "There's more," she said. The florist charge Marcus had noted, the one that had first caught his attention 3 weeks before his investigation formally began, had been billed to his home address. A confirmation email, recovered through the account's digital trail, showed an arrangement of white orchids delivered not to Nicole's office, as Marcus had assumed, but to a hotel room in downtown Nashville. A room booked in Nicole's name for a Tuesday evening Marcus now remembered clearly, because he had been on a site visit in Clarksville and had texted her goodnight at 9:47 p.m., and she had texted back with a heart emoji and a sleeping face. He had that text thread still. Timestamped, he opened the new folder on his desktop. He had named it simply Documentation. He added the florist confirmation, the hotel booking, the text screenshots, and Patricia's summary memo. He closed the laptop and looked out the window at the oak tree in the backyard that he had planted as a sapling the first fall they moved in. It was a substantial tree now. That was the thing about planting things correctly. They grew whether or not you were watching. The reckoning did not happen at a restaurant or a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in early November, at the house on Harrington Place that Marcus had renovated, and Nicole believed she was about to receive as the primary asset in a divorce she had quietly filed 6 days earlier through a separate attorney, a filing Marcus had known about within 48 hours. Because Patricia had contacts, and because the documentation Marcus had already assembled made the legal landscape entirely different from what Nicole had calculated. Nicole arrived at 2 o'clock expecting a mediation session with a single mediator and Marcus's presumed cooperation. What she found was Patricia Wynne, seated at the dining room table with a leather document portfolio open in front of her. Gerald sat in the chair near the window, still and quiet. Nicole's own mother, June, sat at the far end of the table with the expression of a woman who had come knowing something her daughter did not know she knew. Drew Whitfield was not present. He had received a separate communication from Patricia's office that morning that Marcus had not been privy to, though he understood its general nature. Nicole stood in the doorway and looked at the room and made a quick recalibration behind her eyes that Marcus watched happen in real time. She smiled. She moved to the table and sat down and said, pleasantly, "I didn't realize this was going to be a full meeting." Patricia said, "It is." She opened the portfolio. She placed the first document on the table and slid it toward Nicole. It was the transfer history, all 43 transactions, dated, sourced, and annotated. Nicole looked at it. Her expression remained measured. "There are explanations for all of that," she said. "I'm sure," Patricia said, without inflection. She placed a second document, the credit card statements, 19 months. These were paid with marital funds. The account is in your name alone. Nicole said nothing. A third document, the hotel booking, the florist confirmation, the timestamp on the text thread. The fourth document was the one that changed the temperature of the room completely. It was a summary of the fraud complaint filed against Drew Whitfield, the prior transfers from 2 previous sources, and a documented pattern that a forensic accountant had classified, in writing, as a coordinated financial extraction scheme. Nicole's composure shifted for the first time. It was subtle, a slight tightening around her eyes, a fractional stillness in her hands. But Marcus saw it. "Drew told you this would work," Marcus said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was the same register it had always been. Unhurried, clear. Nicole looked at him. "Marcus, he's done this before," Marcus said. "2 other women. Neither of them knew until it was too late. You're the third." He paused. "He wasn't planning a future with you. He was planning a payout." Nicole's mother said, from the far end of the table, "Nicole." Just the name. Just that. Nicole looked at her mother. Something in her expression broke briefly. Not with remorse, but with the particular shock of someone realizing they had miscounted the people in the room and the allegiances arrayed against them. She turned back to Marcus. She tried the last option available to her. "I made mistakes," she said. "I know I did. But we can. There has to be a way to." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "You told me I would die alone and broke," he said. "I've thought about that every day since." He reached into the document portfolio and removed one final sheet. He placed it on the table without drama. "That's the summary balance sheet from the holding company I incorporated in 2016. You never asked what I did on Saturdays. I was building something. I'd been building it for 9 years before I met you." Nicole looked at the document. The room was very quiet. "The joint account was the account I used for household expenses," Marcus continued. "The $127,000 you moved, that's been documented, and it'll be recovered in full through the divorce proceedings, along with the value of the marital assets you attempted to undervalue in your filing." He stood. "I'm not angry," he said quietly. "I'm clear. Those are different things." He gathered nothing, because there was nothing he needed to gather. He had already moved what mattered. He walked to the door and opened it, and stepped through it without looking back. And the room behind him was absolutely silent, and Nicole sat at the table surrounded by the precise and documented shape of her own decisions. 8 months later, Marcus sat on the deck of a house in East Nashville that he had purchased and renovated over a spring and summer, board by board, choosing white oak for the decking because it was harder and more resistant to weather, and because his grandfather would have approved of the decision. It was early morning. The coffee was good. The light came in from the east. He had restructured the holding company in the spring, bringing in 2 new partners, younger engineers who reminded him of himself at that age, and taken on a municipal infrastructure contract worth $3 million over 3 years. He had also, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, accepted a phone call from Forbes, whose small business desk was profiling infrastructure entrepreneurs in mid-tier southern cities. The piece ran 6 weeks later. His grandmother's photographs sat on the bookshelf behind his desk on the day the journalist came to interview him. He had met Renee at a neighborhood association meeting 8 months ago. She was a physician's assistant with a dry sense of humor and a direct way of asking questions, and no interest whatsoever in performing anything for anyone. She was in the kitchen now, making something that smelled like cinnamon. She had not asked about the Forbes piece. She had read it and said simply, "You did all of that while you were with her?" He had said yes. She had nodded. "That must have been lonely," she said. It was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. Nicole was working. He had heard through her mother, who still called Gerald occasionally, as an administrative coordinator at a property management company in Murfreesboro. Drew Whitfield's LLC had been dissolved following a second fraud complaint that Patricia's documentation had helped accelerate. He had relocated, last Gerald heard, to a smaller city. Her network of Nashville contacts, the same circles she had cultivated so carefully, the dinners and the events and the carefully maintained relationships, had contracted severely, with the speed and totality that came from an industry that ran on trust. He had heard all of this through a third party. He had registered it. He had moved on. The oak tree from the old yard had not come with him, of course. But he had already planted one in the corner of this lot, a sapling, 2 feet tall, staked against the wind. He had put it in the ground on the first Saturday after he moved in. By any reasonable estimate, it would outlast everything that had ever troubled him. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.